Rain fell in a steady murmur against the windshield of Clara's old Honda as she parked in the Supermercado del Norte's lot. It was very late, much later than she should have been out. But she needed groceries, and it was the only place open in the town of San Marcos after midnight. The flickering lights of the supermarket sign cast a sickly yellow glow over the wet pavement. The place seemed deserted, but the open sign continued to blink weakly, inviting her in. Clara adjusted her hood before stepping out of the car, and the rain immediately soaked her shoes. She hurried to the automatic doors, which opened with a metallic creak. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, with a faint odor of spoiled goods and cleaning chemicals. She grabbed a cart, its wheels squeaking as she pushed it down the empty aisles. The supermarket felt eerily quiet, even for this time of night. She expected to see a night shift employee restocking shelves or perhaps another customer in a similar rush, but there was no one. Not even a cashier. Clara shrugged. This place had always been a little neglected, never well maintained. She headed to the produce section, trying to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. The neon lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally, intensifying the uncomfortable silence. As she moved through the aisles gathering essentials, a sense of unease began to creep over her. It felt as though the entire supermarket was observing her. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the security cameras, their small red lights on, watching her like eyes in the darkness. Clara tried to shake off her paranoid thoughts, but the feeling lingered. She looked nervously around, and something didn't add up. The products on the shelves seemed different, full of brands she had never seen. The labels on the cans looked strange, with unfamiliar images and writing in languages she didn't recognize. Something was wrong, and her unease grew, but she decided to press on. She reached the meat section and things started to get weirder. The refrigerators hummed quietly, but the meat inside was poorly preserved, a dark gray color streaked with black veins. It looked as though it had been there for weeks. She leaned in closer to check the labels, but there were no prices or expiration dates. Clara backed away, a chill running down her spine. Just as she was about to leave, a sound stopped her cold. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was calling her. Clara. She felt her blood freeze. She spun around quickly, but no one was there. Only the hum of the refrigerators and the distant squeak of her cart. Her eyes scanned the shelves, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the ventilation system. Old places like this always made strange noises, didn't they? But that sound had been too clear. Too personal. With her heart pounding, she pushed her cart toward the dairy section, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Turning the corner into the next aisle, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, at the end of the aisle, stood a man. He was completely still, half hidden in the shadows between two shelves. Clara felt a surge of terror. The man wore an old supermarket employee uniform, a red apron over a white shirt and a black name tag on his chest. But his face was covered with a makeshift mask of human skin, as if someone had attempted to hide something much darker beneath. The figure didn't move or blink. He just stared at her. Clara backed up, her breath quickening. She knew she needed to run, but something about his stillness terrified her more than anything else. She turned and ran toward the exit, leaving her cart behind. Her footsteps echoed in the empty supermarket, amplifying the terrifying silence. When she reached the checkout counters, something was wrong. The conveyor belts were still, the registers dark, and behind the counter, standing perfectly motionless, was another man in the same uniform and the same horrifying mask. The air in the store grew colder. The lights above her flickered and dimmed. Clara was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape. The automatic doors, her only way out, were closed. She ran toward them, pounding on the glass with her hands, but they wouldn't budge. The open sign blinked weakly above her, as if the store itself was holding her captive. Around her, figures began to appear. Dozens of them, standing between the aisles, behind the shelves. They were men, all masked, watching her without moving. Clara backed away, her whole body shaking with terror. Then in the shadows, she heard the whisper again. Clara. The voice was right behind her this time. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her throat. Just inches away stood another man, his mask stained with dried blood. His eyes stared at her unblinking, and a twisted smile peeked out from beneath the stretched skin. "Welcome to Supermercado del Norte, how can I help you?" the man asked in a sickly sweet voice. Clara screamed, stumbling backward until she hit the checkout counter. The masked men began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing in around her. The sound of their footsteps filled the supermarket, mixing with the buzz of the flickering lights. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but she was trapped. The lights flickered once more, buzzing loudly, and then went out completely. Clara was plunged into darkness, her breath coming in short gasps. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them closing in. She could hear their shuffling footsteps, and sickly whispers repeated her name. "Clara, Clara!" The fear choked her, the cold air hurting her lungs. She closed her eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. But the fear was real. Suddenly, cold hands grabbed her from behind. Clara screamed and struggled, but she couldn't break free. The whispers grew louder until everything fell silent. The last thing she heard was the same sickly sweet voice whispering in her ear, "Thank you for shopping with us." The supermarket doors finally opened, and rain fell softly over the entrance, but Clara was gone. The next morning, Supermercado del Norte opened as usual. The flickering sign remained, and the dim lights illuminated the aisles. Customers entered and exited, unaware of what had happened the previous night. And in a corner behind the counters there was a new employee. Her face was hidden behind a grotesque mask, and on her name tag it read, Clara. It was a terribly cold night when Fernando parked his car in the Los Pinos supermarket lot. Outside, the wind blew fiercely, but the robust, massive building of the supermarket stood firm against the storm. The automatic doors glowed with a faint blue light. Los Pinos was the only supermarket open for miles around, and after a long day of work, Fernando had no other choice but to stop and get his groceries. From the moment he crossed the automatic doors, he noticed something strange. The atmosphere inside was too quiet in an unnatural way. The usual hum of the freezers and background music were absent. Instead, there was only an eerie silence. Fernando looked around. The store was empty. There wasn't a single customer, and he didn't see any employees at the registers or stocking shelves. A dim, yellowish light bathed the aisles, casting long, dark shadows. As he pushed his cart down the aisles, the squeak of the wheels was the only thing breaking the sepulchral silence. Though he tried to ignore it, the feeling that he was not alone crept over him. He quickly grabbed a few items, hurrying his movements as a shiver ran down his spine. Then he saw it. At the end of one of the aisles, a figure was standing completely still. At first, Fernando thought it might be another late-night shopper, but something about the person's posture deeply unsettled him. The person was turned away from him, dressed in dark, worn-out clothing. Their rigidity was unnatural, as if frozen in place. He blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the figure didn't move. The sense of danger grew, making him feel uneasy. "Hello?" Fernando called out with an uncertain voice, breaking the store's heavy silence. There was no response. The figure didn't even seem to react. Deciding he didn't need any more products, he slowly pushed his cart toward the front of the store. Convinced the few items he'd gathered would be enough. The figure remained motionless like a forgotten shadow. However, the closer he got to the exit, the heavier the atmosphere felt around him. His entire body told him he had to leave. Just as he reached the registers, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging the store into total darkness. Fernando froze. His heart pounded as he fumbled for his phone to light his way. The faint glow barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to see the exit. He started walking toward the door, but something moved in the shadows. A dragging sound, soft at first, then louder, as if something heavy was being dragged along the floor. Fernando's pulse quickened as he moved the light from his phone around, searching for the source of the noise. At the end of the aisle, the figure was gone. A cold fear enveloped him, and he abandoned his cart, running toward the automatic doors. When he reached them, he pounded on them with his fists, trying to force them open, but they were locked. The blue light above the doors flickered menacingly, as if the store had trapped him. The dragging sound grew closer and closer. Fernando's breath was shallow and uneven as he swept his phone in every direction, searching desperately. And then he saw it. Just a few yards away, in the middle of the aisle, the figure was there again. This time he could see more clearly. It wasn't a coat they were wearing, but dirty, torn clothing. Their skin was weathered and rough, with a twisted expression and eyes filled with hate. It was a man, but there was something disturbing in the way he watched Fernando, as if calculating when to strike. Fernando's heart beat violently as the figure began to move slowly toward him menacingly. It wasn't some supernatural creature, but a deranged, dangerous man. His body was tense like a predator stalking its prey. Overcome with panic, Fernando pounded on the glass door in desperation, but it wouldn't budge. The man drew closer and closer. Fernando could hear his ragged breathing, and the air around him felt cold, as if he were in imminent danger. In a panic, he leaped over the checkout counter, falling to the floor behind it. His phone flew from his hand, rolling across the floor and leaving him almost completely in darkness. He scrambled backward, trying to distance himself from his pursuer. The silence was deafening. For a few seconds, all he could hear was his own labored breathing. Then he heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, as though the man was searching for him. Fernando closed his eyes, every muscle in his body tense, trying to make no sound. And then, right above him, a voice startled him. "Are you ready to pay?" The voice was soft, almost polite, but there was something deeply disturbing about it, something hollow and dangerous. Slowly, Fernando opened his eyes. Through the faint light still shining from his phone, he saw the man leaning over the counter. His face wore a twisted, disturbing smile. The man reached out a hand toward him, with long, tense fingers clearly aiming to grab him. Fernando tried to scream, but no sound came out. His whole body froze in terror as the man's hand moved closer to him. But just as it seemed he would be caught, the lights flickered again. In an instant, the man backed away. The aisle was empty once more, and the store returned to its previous dim, yellowish light. Fernando was breathing heavily as he stood up, his legs trembling. Silence reigned once again. With his heart still racing, Fernando grabbed his phone and, without a second thought, headed for the exit. This time, the automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and the cold night air enveloped him. He didn't look back as he ran to his car, closing the door behind him and driving away quickly. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, there was the man, standing under the blue light at the entrance of the supermarket, watching him silently. Although Fernando couldn't hear him, he knew exactly what he was whispering. "Come back soon." It was a calm Thursday night when Camila entered the aisles of the San Marcos supermarket. She hadn't planned to shop so late, but realizing her refrigerator was empty, she drove to the only store open in her small town. San Marcos was an old supermarket, with aisles set too close together and a lingering smell of dampness that permeated everything, as though forgotten products and wet cardboard had settled into every corner. The fluorescent lights flickered above her as she pushed her cart, and the squeak of the wheels was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. There were no other shoppers. The place seemed deserted. Although Camila had been there many times before that night, the atmosphere felt different, unsettling even. She glanced down both sides of the aisles, hoping to spot one of the employees she knew so well, but no one was in sight. The supermarket felt strange, as if something was out of place, too quiet, as if she shouldn't be there. As she picked up a carton of milk, something in the reflection of the refrigerator caught her eye. A fleeting figure moved at the end of the dairy aisle. Camila turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. Just rows of silent refrigerators, their glass doors fogged with condensation. She blinked, trying to shake off the growing sense of alarm inside her, but dismissed it quickly, attributing it to the fatigue of a long day. She quickened her pace, trying to finish her shopping as fast as possible. However, the longer she stayed in the store, the more strange details she began to notice. The cans on the shelves were no longer the familiar brands. Their labels bore strange, unknown names. Some products looked as if they had been there for years, covered in dust as though forgotten. She picked up a cereal box, and the character on the cover smiled at her disturbingly with too many teeth. Camila frowned, quickly putting the box back on the shelf while trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease. As she turned the corner and reached the frozen section, her stomach twisted with nerves. The freezer stretched down a long, dimly lit aisle. The lights flickered in the distance just beyond her reach. Then she saw it again. This time it wasn't fleeting. A man stood motionless in front of one of the freezer doors. His back was to her, and he was wearing a white apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. Camila held her breath. "Hello," she said, her voice echoing in the tense air of the empty store. The man didn't move. Camilla's heart pounded hard as she took a step forward. She squinted, trying to see his face, but something about his stiff, unnatural posture stirred a deep fear within her. Slowly, she took a few more cautious steps. The hum of the freezers grew louder, resonating in her head. "Sir," she repeated, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the man turned his head abruptly, a movement so sharp it made Camilla's heart skip a beat. The man's head didn't stop at a normal position. His neck kept turning until his face was fully visible. It wasn't a supernatural twist, but his expression was unsettling. He wore a grotesque smile and his face was disfigured, as though he'd suffered an accident or an illness that had deformed his features. Camilla gasped, stepping back. The man's smile stretched in a disturbing way, as if he enjoyed her reaction. His bloodshot eyes didn't stop watching her as he remained still, but that terrifying smile stared directly at her. Without a second thought, Camilla turned and ran down the aisle, pushing her cart, which clattered against the shelves. Her breathing was erratic as she ran, weaving through the aisles, desperate to find the exit. But the lights began to flicker, casting shadows over the store, and she could barely see where she was going. Her own footsteps echoed, but she soon realized she wasn't alone. She could hear them now, other footsteps, soft but steady, coming from somewhere within the store. Camilla's heart pounded as she ran faster, the other footsteps drawing closer. The sound multiplied as if several individuals were following her. She rounded a corner and nearly stumbled. In the middle of the aisle stood a group of figures, all wearing dirty aprons, their backs to her. They were completely still, as if they'd been waiting for her. They were men, all of them, and their rigid, tense bodies gave Camilla a sense of imminent danger. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear, as if waiting for a signal to act. Camilla backed away slowly, but as soon as she moved, the figures began to turn toward her. They didn't do it in a supernatural way, but their movements were clumsy and disturbing. Their smiles were grotesque, and their eyes, full of rage, stared intensely at her. Fear paralyzed her, but she had to escape. She was breathing in shallow gasps as she searched for the exit. Finally, she saw it, the bright exit sign above the door. She ran toward it, but when she arrived, the doors didn't open. She pounded on the glass with her fists, trying to open them, but they wouldn't budge. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, pale and terrified. And behind her, she saw the men drawing closer, reaching their hands toward her. Camilla screamed, pounding on the door in desperation. She was trapped. Before she could try again, cold hands grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her back into the darkness. The men surrounded her and everything went black. The next morning, San Marcos supermarket opened as usual. The employees arrived, the lights turned on, and the shelves were stocked. But Camilla had disappeared. Weeks later, a new employee appeared in the aisles, a woman with a vacant expression and a forced smile. She walked stiffly, watching anyone who entered the store, with her dirty apron and eyes filled with a disturbing stillness. Late one night, Alejandro found himself entering the Gran Ahorro supermarket, a massive 24-hour establishment on the outskirts of the city. He had passed it many times but had never stopped. It wasn't just the distance, it was the rumors. People said strange things happened in the supermarket after dark. Disappearances, flickering lights, people who never came back. But Alejandro didn't believe those stories. He just needed to buy a few groceries, and the store was open. That was all that mattered. As he entered, the automatic doors slid closed behind him with a soft hum. The store was eerily quiet. Alejandro had expected to see some activity, even at this late hour, but there was no one around. The lights above him buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the aisles, which seemed to stretch out endlessly into the dimness. There were no employees or customers in sight, just an uncomfortable silence. He grabbed a cart, the sound of metal echoing louder than expected in the empty space. As he moved down the first aisle, he noticed the products on the shelves. Everything looked too clean, overly organized. The cans were perfectly aligned, all labels facing forward, but none of them bore brands he recognized. Alejandro picked up a can and examined it. The label was faded, the image blurred, and the product name was unreadable, as if something had gone wrong with the printing. He searched for an expiration date but found none. A chill ran down his spine. Maybe they just stocked products from lesser-known brands or dubious sources. Alejandro put the can back on the shelf, deciding he'd only take the essentials that night. He headed to the produce section where the lights were so bright they almost seemed clinical. At first glance, everything appeared fresh, perfectly ripe, but when he picked up an apple, he recoiled. The skin was strangely soft and bruised, and when he squeezed another one, it split open, revealing a black, moldy interior. An unpleasant odor filled the air. Alejandro dropped the fruit in disgust and wiped his hand on his pants, feeling that something wasn't right about this place. He looked around again, expecting to see an employee or someone stocking shelves, but the store remained deserted. He thought about leaving, but he figured he only needed a few more things before he could go. As he moved toward the dairy section, he noticed the shelves were increasingly bare. At first, it was just an empty bottle here and there, but by the time he reached the refrigerated aisle, entire sections were completely empty. The freezer doors were slightly ajar, allowing a cold mist to spill onto the floor. That's when he saw it, a movement at the end of the aisle. Alejandro stopped, squinting to see better through the mist. A figure stood near the freezer doors with its back to him. It was hard to make out, but it seemed to be a man tall and thin, dressed in the Gran Ahorro uniform. But his clothes were dirty and torn. The man didn't move, he was just standing there, motionless in front of the empty freezers. Alejandro cleared his throat. "Hey, do you know where the milk is?" The figure didn't respond or turn around. A feeling of unease prickled Alejandro's skin. He took a cautious step forward, the sound of his shoes echoing on the tiled floor in the oppressive silence. "Do you work here?" he asked more firmly. Still no response. Frustration began to mix with his discomfort. He approached more quickly now, ready to tap the man on the shoulder. "I just need—" The figure turned suddenly, and Alejandro was left speechless. The man's face was completely covered in bandages, as though he'd suffered severe burns or disfigurement. His eyes were barely visible, hidden behind layers of dirty, worn gauze. Alejandro took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The bandaged man stood still for a moment as if observing him through the layers. Then he slowly raised his arm, pointing a crooked finger at Alejandro. Without a second thought, Alejandro ran down the aisle, his heart pounding loudly in his ears. The cold from the freezers seemed to cling to him as he ran, turning the corner and nearly crashing into another row of shelves. He abandoned his cart and kept running toward the store exit. But when he reached the entrance, the automatic doors weren't there. Where the doors should have been, the walls extended without interruption, with no sign of an exit, glass, or any way out. Alejandro's mind reeled with panic. He couldn't understand how the place had changed. The aisles no longer led where he remembered. From deep within the store, he heard a sound. Something was dragging across the floor, as if someone were moving something heavy. At first it was distant, but it grew closer with each passing second. Alejandro's pulse quickened as he looked around, searching for a place to hide. But then he saw them. Figures, several of them, emerging from the dark aisles, all dressed in the dirty supermarket uniforms, moving strangely as if their joints were damaged. The figures slowly approached, dragging themselves toward him. Their heads tilted at odd angles and their movements were jerky, as though something inside them was broken. Alejandro stepped back, trembling. He looked toward the customer service counter, hoping to find an emergency exit or a back door any way out. But when he got there, one of the figures was already there, standing motionless, watching him from behind the counter. A rough voice echoed through the air. "Can I help you with something?" Alejandro collapsed to the floor, unable to control his panic. The sinister figures drew closer, their soft footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then right next to his ear, he heard the voice again, barely a whisper. "Thank you for shopping at Gran Ahorro." The lights flickered back on, casting their sickly glow, but Alejandro was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Gran Ahorro supermarket opened as usual. The shelves were restocked, the floors polished, and customers arrived with no knowledge of what had happened the night before. And behind the checkout counter stood a new employee with a bandaged face, standing motionless at his post, as though waiting for something. It was almost midnight when Jimena entered the Los Robles market, the only supermarket still open in her quiet town. She had left her shopping for the last minute, And now, under the fluorescent lights, she regretted it. The atmosphere was unsettling. The usual daytime hustle had been replaced by a sepulchral silence. The automatic doors slid closed behind her, emitting a soft mechanical hum, and she immediately felt a chill. The air inside was colder than expected, as though the cooling system was at full blast, which made her uneasy as she walked down the aisles. She shivered and adjusted her jacket, grabbing a basket as she passed through the produce section. Something wasn't right. The vegetables looked spoiled. Apples with dark spots, wilted lettuce, and the faint smell of rot permeated the air. Jimena frowned but decided to ignore it and headed for the packaged goods. As she moved through the aisles, she began to notice something strange about the products. The labels, although familiar, looked slightly warped, as if they had been sitting on the shelves too long. The faded colors and unreadable expiration dates gave her an eerie feeling that the place wasn't entirely normal. But what disturbed her most was the sensation that the place was completely empty. Not a single employee in sight. She reached the dairy section and picked up a carton of milk, but upon checking it, she noticed it had expired over a month ago. Surprised, she checked another carton. Same thing. All the dairy products were expired. A small current of panic began to grow in her chest, and she decided it would be best to leave immediately. As she turned to go, something at the end of the aisle caught her attention. A tall, thin figure in a disheveled supermarket uniform stood completely still, facing away from her. Jimena tried to shake off her discomfort, but something about the man's rigid posture deeply disturbed her. She approached cautiously, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me," she said loudly. "Do you work here? The milk is expired." No response. The man didn't move an inch. Jimena's pulse began to race for no apparent reason. She took a step back, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave the place as soon as possible. As she walked toward the front of the store, the lights flickered, plunging the aisle into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Jimena dropped the milk carton she was holding. The man she had seen earlier was now standing right in front of her. The air grew thicker. The man's face seemed disfigured, with deep scars running across his cheeks. His eyes were swollen, surrounded by dark circles. His mouth, twisted into a grotesque smile, was cracked and misshapen, giving him a disturbing appearance. Jimena took a step back, her heart racing wildly. She decided to run toward the exit, but as she turned the corner of the aisle, the man was there, blocking her path. It was impossible for him to have moved so quickly. His smile stretched even wider in an almost inhuman way. "Are you lost?" the man murmured, his voice hoarse and ragged. Jimena felt a knot in her stomach at those words. It was clear that something was very wrong with him. She stammered a response as she slowly backed away. "No, I'm just leaving," she managed to say, her voice trembling. The man didn't move. He just stared at her, his head tilted slightly. Without wasting another moment, Jimena turned and ran toward the exit. But when she reached the automatic doors, they didn't open. She pounded on the glass, desperate to get out, but the doors wouldn't budge. Behind her, she heard soft footsteps approaching. "Are you lost?" the man asked again, his voice closer than it should have been. Jimena turned abruptly, but the aisle was empty. The man had vanished. A slight sigh of relief washed over her, but it quickly faded as she realized she was trapped. She ran to the service counter, hoping to find a back exit. Turning the corner, her heart stopped. The man was standing by the storage room door, blocking her only escape route. This time, his smile was wider, as if he were enjoying the situation. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice laced with hidden menace. Jimena backed away, her mind racing as she desperately searched for a way out. The man advanced, moving with an eerie stiffness as if his body didn't quite work right. Jimena ran in the opposite direction, her breathing frantic, her footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. Every turn she took led her back to the same place. It was as if the supermarket were an endless maze. Then she heard it, a wet, dragging sound like something being pulled across the floor. She stopped, trembling, and looked behind her. The man was crawling toward her, his limbs twisted at strange angles, his deformed face showing an expression of pure madness. "Are you lost?" he murmured again, his voice more guttural than before. Jimena screamed and ran toward the back exit, where an emergency sign flickered weakly. She reached the door, trying to open it with all her strength, but it was sealed shut. The sound of the man approaching froze her. When she turned, he was right behind her, his face just inches from hers. "Thank you for shopping at Los Robles," he whispered before everything went dark. The next morning, Los Robles Market opened as usual. The employees didn't notice anything strange. The products were organized and customers began arriving as they would any other day. Jimena was never seen again, and if anyone noticed her absence, they didn't mention it. But sometimes late at night, when the store is quiet, if you listen closely, you can hear a distant whisper. And if you're unlucky, you might come across someone who was never meant to be there. The rain pounded relentlessly on the roof of the northern market as Lydia hurried inside, shaking off the cold drops that clung to her coat. The storm had come suddenly, turning the calm afternoon into a cold and miserable night. She only needed to pick up a few quick items, bread, milk, maybe some fruit, but the rain had forced her to stay in the store longer than she had planned. The place was almost empty, as it usually was at this hour of the night. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of the refrigerators broke the silence. Lydia walked quickly through the aisles, eager to finish her shopping and get home before the storm worsened. But something about the store that night made her uncomfortable. It was hard to pinpoint, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if something in the air wasn't right. As she passed by the canned goods aisle, she noticed the shelves were unusually empty. Several products were missing, leaving gaps where there would normally be cans. A sense of unease began to creep up her spine. The store was always well stocked, even at night. She shrugged it off, blaming it on the bad weather and fatigue. Still, the feeling of discomfort lingered. Turning the corner to enter the produce section, Lydia stopped dead in her tracks. There was someone else in the store. A woman stood at the end of the aisle, her back to Lydia. She hadn't heard anyone else come in, and the store was completely empty when she arrived. The woman remained motionless, her figure bathed in the flickering light from above. Something about her posture unsettled Lydia. Her head was tilted downward as if looking at something on the floor. Lydia hesitated for a moment but decided to approach. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice breaking the silence uncomfortably. The woman didn't move. Lydia's heartbeat began to quicken. She wasn't sure why, but the woman's stillness was unnerving. She took another step, clearing her throat. "Are you okay?" There was no response. The woman stayed there, her head tilted at that strange angle. Lydia's breathing grew faster. Something wasn't right. She decided it wasn't her problem and turned toward the dairy section, trying to ignore what she had just seen. But the image of the frozen woman and her strange posture continued to haunt her. As she bent down to grab a carton of milk, the lights flickered, plunging the aisle into momentary darkness. Lydia froze, clutching the milk carton, her breath hitching. The lights came back on and she dropped the carton, which shattered on the floor, spilling milk down the aisle. The woman was at the end of the dairy aisle, staring at her. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The woman wasn't just looking at her. There was something disturbingly wrong with her face. Her skin was pale and stretched tight, and her eyes were large and empty, framed by deep shadows. Her mouth was twisted in a grotesque smile, her lips cracked and stretched in an unnatural way. Lydia took a step back, her heart pounding violently. She didn't care that her shoes were soaking in spilled milk. She had to get out of there. She quickly turned and started walking toward the exit, but as she rounded the next aisle, she stopped dead. The woman was there, blocking her path. Lydia's mind raced. There was no way the woman could have moved that fast. She had just left her behind, and now she was here, right in front of her. The woman's smile widened even more, twisting in an almost unbearable way. "Are you lost?" the woman asked in a hoarse, weak voice. Lydia's stomach turned. The woman hadn't spoken before, but now her tone was cold, lifeless, making Lydia feel sick. Lydia tried to step back, forcing herself to stay calm. "No, I'm just leaving," she stammered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't move. She just watched her with those expressionless eyes and the perverse smile fixed on her face. Then she tilted her head even more, producing a horrible cracking sound that echoed through the empty store. With trembling hands, Lydia decided to run toward the exit. But when she reached the automatic doors, she found that they wouldn't open. She pounded on the glass repeatedly, hoping the doors would move, but they remained shut. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching. "Are you lost?" the woman asked, closer this time, too close. Lydia turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. The woman had disappeared. A momentary sense of relief flooded her. but it was quickly replaced by an even deeper fear. Something was terribly wrong with that store, and she needed to get out as soon as possible. She ran toward the back of the store, hoping to find an emergency exit in the storage area. But when she rounded the corner, the woman was there, standing in front of the door with that same grotesque smile that seemed to mock her situation. "You can't leave," the woman said, her voice now lower and threatening. Lydia's pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step back, but the woman moved forward slowly, her movement strange, as if her limbs didn't work properly. Lydia turned and ran into the aisles again, desperately searching for an exit. But every turn seemed to bring her back to the same place, trapped in an endless maze. She heard a sound behind her, a soft scraping, like something being dragged along the floor. Lydia stopped, her breath coming in gasps. She slowly turned her head and saw the woman crawling toward her with twisted, abnormal movements, as if something in her body was broken. "Are you lost?" the woman whispered, her voice hoarse and grotesque. Lydia screamed and ran, not caring where she went. She just wanted to escape. The sound of the woman crawling behind her didn't stop, always close, following her through the endless maze of shelves and flickering lights. Finally, she saw a door, the emergency exit, with its faint sign glowing. She ran toward it, desperate to get out, but when she reached it, the door wouldn't open. The scraping sound stopped. Lydia turned slowly, her heart racing. The woman was right behind her, her deformed smile inches from her face. "Are you lost?" the woman whispered. Her voice was the last thing Lydia heard before everything went black. The next morning, the manager of the northern market opened the doors as usual. The shelves were stocked, the store clean and organized, and customers began to enter, oblivious to what had happened the night before. Lydia was never seen again. But sometimes when the store is quiet, if you listen carefully, you can hear a faint whisper in the darkness. And if you're unlucky, you might meet someone who shouldn't be there. The clock struck 10 at night as Jorge locked his car and entered Supermarket La Colonia, a small grocery store that seemed trapped in time. Located on the outskirts of town, the flickering neon sign above the entrance buzzed constantly. Though the place looked run down, it was the only store open at that hour, and Jorge just needed to pick up a few things before heading home. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a pale glow, creating long shadows in the aisles. He grabbed a basket, distracted by his thoughts, not noticing how unusually quiet the store was. There was no sound, not even the usual hum of the refrigerators. Only the crunch of his steps on the dirty floor broke the oppressive silence. He quickly picked up a loaf of bread and some canned goods before heading to the frozen section. When he arrived, he noticed that the freezers were turned off and all the glass doors were fogged over. He wiped one of the doors to get a better view, but the freezers were empty. He frowned. There were no products in sight, just a thin layer of frost on the inner walls. He thought maybe the store was in the middle of restocking. As he continued through the aisles, he grew increasingly puzzled. Empty shelves, desolate display cases, and strangest of all, there wasn't a single worker in the store. When he reached the end of the aisle, something else caught his attention. A section of the floor had tiles in a different color. At first glance, it was barely noticeable, but Jorge stopped, crouching to examine it more closely. He ran his fingers over the cracks separating the tiles, noticing that they moved slightly when he pressed them. It looked like a hidden trapdoor under the floor. A chill ran down his spine. He stood up quickly, looking around. The store was still empty. There was no one else in the place. Suddenly, the lights flickered above him. He froze, his heart beginning to beat faster. When the lights stabilized, the feeling of unease persisted. He decided it was best to finish up quickly and leave. As he walked toward the front of the store, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a soft scratching noise, almost imperceptible, coming from the back of the supermarket. Jorge hesitated. His instinct told him to leave, but his curiosity pushed him to find out what was causing the noise. Finally, he decided to cautiously approach. The sound grew louder as he got closer to the storage room door. The air felt colder, and the lighting was dimmer in that area. When he reached the metal door leading to the storage room, he looked through the small window, hoping to see a worker. But there was nothing, just shadows. He took a breath, pushed the door, and it opened with a creak. On the other side, in the dark storage room, he saw a hunched figure on the floor scraping something against the concrete. Jorge couldn't clearly make out what it was doing, but the metallic sound sent chills down his spine. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The figure stopped moving but didn't respond or turn around. It remained crouched, completely still. Jorge stepped back, feeling the fear tightening his stomach. "I was just looking for the manager," he tried to explain, taking another step back. The figure began to slowly rise. Jorge's breath caught. It was a tall, thin person with slumped shoulders and unusually long arms, as if their body were deformed by some strange condition. The scraping sound resonated in the storage room again, louder and more menacing. Without thinking twice, Jorge turned on his heel and started running toward the front of the store. His footsteps echoed through the empty aisles as the lights above him flickered more frequently. He felt something following him. The sound of something heavy dragging along with the scraping grew closer with each step. His mind raced. He had to find the exit, but as he ran, the aisles looked unfamiliar, as if the store had changed shape. The shelves felt taller, oppressive, and the store seemed to stretch further than he remembered. As he turned down one of the aisles, he stopped abruptly. The floor in front of him was cracked, right where he had seen the oddly placed tiles. This time, the tiles had shifted even more, revealing a dark crevice. A nauseating stench hit him suddenly, the smell of rot and decay. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the store, shaking the walls. Jorge took a step back, but before he could move, something cold grabbed his ankle. He looked down, horrified to see a pale, bony hand reaching out from the crevice. The hand gripped him with inhuman strength, pulling him toward the opening in the floor. In a desperate struggle, he kicked with all his might, managing to free himself for a brief moment. He quickly got up, gasping for air, searching frantically for an exit. But then, more hands began to emerge, crawling out of the crevice, scratching and clawing at the floor. The long skeletal fingers moved in every direction, trying to reach him. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into total darkness. When the lights came back on, Jorge saw something that froze his blood. At the end of the aisle, the figure from the storage room was now standing. Its head was tilted to the side, its eyes hidden in shadows. Its limbs were incredibly long, and its hands dragged on the floor as it slowly moved toward him. Jorge didn't wait to see more. He ran toward the front of the store with all his strength. But when he arrived, the exit had disappeared. In its place were more aisles, more shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly. A desperate scream escaped his throat as he ran into the maze of shelves, realizing there was no way out. Behind him, the sound of scraping and dragging grew closer. No matter how far he ran, the aisles never ended, and the exit was always out of reach. Finally, the lights went out for good. The last sound Jorge heard before being engulfed by darkness was the low whisper of the figure following him. "You can't leave anymore." The rain beat incessantly on the roof of Los Alamos supermarket as Laura hurried inside, shaking off the cold drops that clung to her coat. The storm had started suddenly, turning the calm night into a soaked chaos. She only planned to grab a few things, bread, milk, maybe some fruit. But the rain had trapped her longer than she expected. The store was deserted, as it usually was at that hour of the night. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint noise from the refrigerators in the back. Laura moved quickly through the aisles, wanting to finish up and get home before the storm got worse. However, the store felt strange that night. It was hard to describe, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air was thick with an oppressive sensation. As she walked down the canned goods aisle, she noticed the shelves were unusually empty. There were gaps where the cans should have been, something that never happened in this store, which was always well stocked. Laura tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, blaming it on the bad weather and the unnerving silence, but the unease persisted. She turned into the fresh produce section and froze. At the end of the aisle, there was a person. It was a woman, standing with her back to Laura, completely still. Laura hadn't heard anyone else come in, and when she arrived, the store was empty. The woman didn't move, her figure bathed in the dim light that occasionally flickered. Something about her posture made Laura nervous. The woman's head was tilted at a strange angle, as if looking at something on the ground. Excuse me," Laura called softly, surprised by how loud her voice sounded in the silent store. The woman didn't respond or move. Laura's heart started to beat faster. The woman's stillness was unsettling. She took another step forward, clearing her throat. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice trembling. No response. The woman remained completely motionless, her head still tilted unnaturally. Laura felt a tightness in her chest and decided she didn't want to know more. She turned and headed to the dairy section. But as she walked, she couldn't get the image of that woman out of her mind, frozen like a statue. When she reached the dairy section, she reached for a milk carton. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the aisle into momentary darkness. Laura stood still, gripping the milk carton tightly. When the lights came back on, the carton slipped from her hands, spilling milk all over the floor. The woman was now at the end of the dairy aisle, staring directly at her. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The woman's head was still tilted in that strange way, but now she could see her face. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp bones. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and there was something deeply disturbing about her expression. Laura felt a stab of fear. Something wasn't right. She had to get out of there. She turned on her heel, leaving everything behind, and started walking quickly toward the exit. However, as she rounded the next aisle, she stopped dead. The woman was there, blocking her path. Laura's heart raced even faster. How had she gotten there so quickly? There was no way she could have seen her pass. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. This time, the woman's expression was even more unsettling. "Are you lost?" the woman asked, her voice soft but raspy, as if her words dragged through the air. Laura's stomach churned. The woman hadn't spoken before, but now her tone was so disturbing it made her feel nauseous. Something was terribly wrong. Taking a step back, she tried to stay calm. "No, I'm just leaving," she replied, trying to sound firm. The woman didn't move. She just watched her, unblinking. Then she tilted her head a bit more, as if waiting for something. Laura's fear grew with each passing second. She turned and ran toward the store's exit. When she reached the automatic doors, she stopped. The doors didn't open. She pounded on the glass, desperate for them to move, but they remained shut. Behind her, she heard a soft noise, like someone dragging their feet slowly across the floor. "Are you lost?" The woman's voice was closer. Laura turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. The woman had disappeared. A momentary sense of relief washed over her, but it was soon replaced by deeper terror. Something was terribly wrong with this place. Desperate, she ran toward the service area, hoping to find an exit through the storage room. When she reached the storage room door, she stopped again. The woman was there, waiting for her. "You can't leave," the woman said in a deeper, almost menacing tone. Laura's fear peaked. She stepped back, but the woman moved toward her, her movements jerky and disjointed, as if someone were controlling her. Laura turned and ran through the aisles, searching for an exit. Every corner brought her back to the same place, the same narrow aisles and flickering lights. Panic suffocated her as she ran faster and faster. Then she heard it. A soft, scratchy sound like something being dragged across the floor. Laura looked behind her. The woman was following her, moving in a strange way as if her joints didn't work properly. Her face hadn't changed, but her eyes seemed brighter, filled with a dangerous intensity. "Are you lost?" the woman said again in a darker tone. Laura screamed and ran as fast as she could. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly, without end. Finally, she saw the emergency exit at the end, the red sign faintly lighting the way. With a final effort, she ran toward it, but when she reached it, the door wouldn't open. The dragging sound stopped right behind her. Laura turned slowly, trembling with fear. The woman was right there, her face just inches away. "You can't leave," she whispered. Her voice was the last thing Laura heard before everything went black. The clock struck 10 at night when Javier locked his car and entered El Super de Jose, a somewhat run-down grocery store on the outskirts of town. Despite the flickering neon sign and the unsettling hum, it was the only place open at that hour. The fluorescent lights inside the store cast a sickly glow and long shadows down the aisles. Javier picked up a shopping basket, determined to grab a few essentials and get back to his apartment as quickly as possible. At first, he didn't notice how quiet the store was. There was no sound coming from the back room, not even the usual hum of the refrigerators. Everything was in complete silence, broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on the dirty linoleum floor. He quickly gathered some bread and cereal and then headed for the frozen section. The rows of freezers were silent, their glass doors fogged over. Javier wiped one of the doors to look inside, but the freezer was empty. He frowned. All the freezers were empty, with only a thin layer of frost clinging to the walls. Maybe they were restocking. He continued down the aisle, passing empty shelves and deserted display cases. At the end of the aisle, Javier noticed something unusual. A section of the floor had tiles in a different color, as if they were covering something up. The patch was grayish, almost blending in with the rest of the dirty floor, but definitely out of place. He crouched down, touching the cold tiles. There was a small crack where the tiles joined. When he pressed a bit harder, the tiles shifted slightly, revealing what seemed to be a trap door. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped back quickly and stood up, glancing around. The store was still empty. There were no workers or customers in sight, no one at the register. Just then, the lights flickered above him. Javier froze, waiting for the lights to stabilize. His heart began to beat faster. Although the flickering stopped, the feeling of unease persisted. Without thinking much more, he left the freezer aisle and walked toward the front of the store. But as he reached the end of the aisle, he heard a sound. It was a faint noise, like something scraping across the floor, coming from the back of the store. It was barely audible over the hum of the lights, but unmistakable. Javier hesitated. His instincts told him to leave, to get out of there as soon as possible. But a mix of curiosity and concern made him move toward the sound, heading deeper into the store, toward the back, where the lights were dimmer and the air felt colder. The scraping grew louder as he approached the storage room door, a metal door with a small window near the top. He looked through the glass, hoping to see an employee moving inside, but there was no one. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed. The door opened slowly, revealing the dark interior of the storage room. Javier stood on the threshold, scanning the darkness with his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw it. At the back of the storage room, a hunched figure was crouched on the floor, scraping something against the concrete. He couldn't make out what it was doing, but the sharp, metallic sound deeply unsettled him. "Hello?" Javier called, his voice trembling. The figure stopped moving. It didn't turn or respond, it just stayed still as if it had been caught in the act. Javier took a step back, fear starting to take hold of him. "I'm just looking for the cashier," he added, his voice barely a whisper. The figure slowly began to rise, and Javier held his breath. The person stood up in a strange way, with slow, unnatural movements. Their limbs were long and thin, almost clumsy. The scraping sound continued, louder this time, almost echoing with their movements. Without waiting to see more, Javier turned around and started running. His footsteps echoed in the empty store as he sprinted toward the exit. The lights above him flickered more frequently, plunging parts of the store into sudden darkness before illuminating them again. The scraping noise followed him, but now it was joined by a heavier sound, as if something were being dragged behind him. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. The aisles, once familiar, now seemed to stretch on endlessly, warping and becoming more claustrophobic. The faster he ran, the more oppressive the shelves became, towering like walls around him. He turned down another aisle, but stopped abruptly. The floor in front of him was cracked, the same strange patch of discolored tiles he had seen earlier. But now the tiles were even more shifted, revealing a crack in the floor. A putrid stench hit him suddenly, the smell of something long dead and rotting. A deep growl echoed through the store, reverberating off the walls. Javier took a step back, but before he could move, something grabbed his ankle. He looked down and saw a pale, emaciated hand reaching out from the crack, clutching his leg tightly. The hand pulled him, trying to drag him toward the floor. Javier kicked desperately, his heart pounding as he fought to free himself. With one final effort, he broke free and scrambled backward. He was breathing hard, but before he could recover, he saw more hands emerging from the floor, pushing through the cracks, scratching and clawing at the ground, stretching out toward him. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into total darkness. When the lights came back on, Javier saw something that made his blood run cold. At the end of the aisle, the man he had seen in the storage room was now standing there. His head was tilted to the side, his eyes hidden in shadows. His limbs were incredibly long, and his hands dragged on the floor as he slowly moved toward him. Javier didn't wait any longer. He ran as fast as he could, feeling fear overwhelm him completely. But when he reached the front of the store, the exit had disappeared. In its place were more aisles, stretching out endlessly in a spiral. A desperate scream escaped his throat as he ran into the maze of shelves, knowing there was no way out. Behind him, The scraping and dragging noises grew closer and closer. No matter how far he ran, the aisles never ended, and the exit was always out of reach. Finally, the lights went out for good. The last sound Javier heard before being swallowed by darkness was the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of the man behind him. "You were in the wrong place.